All right, good afternoon, everyone. Excuse me. Welcome to part 2 of 3 in the Community Development and Equity webinar series hosted by the Yale Urban Learning Community. Today, we're going to be focusing on the intersection of affordable housing, community development, and equity, presented by Ms. Paige Gentry. And, this session is being recorded. And as a quick introduction, Ms. Paige Gentry is a senior associate at Klein Hornig LLP and focuses her practice on affordable housing and community development issues. She primarily represents developers building affordable housing nationwide, lenders financing redevelopment, and businesses in low-income areas of Appalachia, and works with affordable housing developers to finance the installation of solar on their apartment complexes. And prior to law school, she worked at a community economic development corporation where she helped develop their community land trust. So I'm going to pass it over to you, Ms. Paige.
Great. Thank you, Eugen, for having me today, and for everybody else for letting me come and speak with you guys. As Eugen said, I am a senior associate at Klein Hornig, which is a law firm that works predominantly, actually almost solely exclusively, on affordable housing and nonprofit issues. And we bring in a little bit more. So as I said in my profile, I have an experience or experiences doing solar investments and solar installations. So we've been working with low-income housers who are putting solar on their roofs. But it really is focused around community economic development and housing in particular. And I'm particularly excited to be here today and talking to the School of the Environment, though I know you guys just changed your name, so I apologize if I refer to it as the Forestry School, because I know that that's no longer correct. But when I first started out working in an affordable housing developer out in Oregon, was talking to various people in the conservation space, because I thought there could be a lot of connections between the environment and conservation, and the environment and community economic development issues, and basically got flat out told that environmentalists and community economic development people will never work together ever. And development is completely at odds with environmental concerns. And there's some degree of truth to that, but there's also a ton of places to overlap. So it's super exciting to be an affordable housing, community and economic development lawyer coming in to speak with environmental students who are starting to think about or have already been thinking about these various issues and how we could work together as opposed to being at odds over a development or otherwise. So pretty excited to be here, and thanks. So first up, just wanted to go over quickly what I was going to cover, and I think of things in questions. So I have sort of 5 main questions. One is, just as an overview, what is affordable housing and do we have enough? 2, why does it matter? Obviously I work in affordable housing, so I think that it does, but I figure it's worth spending a little bit of time talking about its importance. 3, what on earth does it have to do with the environment and climate change and other things that you guys are working on? 4, how do we actually build it? And then 5, how do we keep it long-term, affordable in the long term? Because one of the things that you see in rapidly gentrifying neighborhoods is people are getting priced out and are having to move into other low-income neighborhoods. And I think if you have a goal of equity and inclusion and diverse neighborhoods, you really have to think about keeping people in place, while at the same time allowing people to build equity. And there's some really knotty questions that I'll get to later on how do you do all of that. So first up, what is affordable housing? Put very simply, it's housing that one household is only paying for about 30% of their salary on, or their income that's coming on. So I figured I would start with Connecticut, and how does Connecticut stack up? So the minimum wage in Connecticut was just changed to $12 an hour. And I think it's going to work up its way to 15 in the next few years. But for right now, when you work that through, you get to about $624 a month that you have, which is 30% of the minimum wage income a month for housing. If you're looking at New Haven and the fair market rents in New Haven, that barely gets you half of what you need to afford a 1-bedroom. And if you're a family and you need a 2-bedroom or 3-bedroom, you're significantly less than half. So we already have this issue, which is our basic income, or what we say is our minimum income, can't afford housing in this country. So you have this huge gap where people are spending upwards of 50 or 60% of their income on housing, which means less money for food, less money for healthcare, less money for anything else. And I'm not sure where you guys are as students, but when I was a student, when housing was taking up 50 or 60% of my income, it's hard. So this is a really interesting study that's done by what would you actually need to make by state in order to afford a 2-bedroom apartment in that state and make that and have that be 30% of your income coming in. For Connecticut, the housing wage is $26.42 an hour. So the national minimum wage is $7.25 an hour. And I was looking around, I think when you look at the various states that are on here, I don't think there's any state that hits at $7.25 an hour will get you a 2-bedroom apartment in the country. So that's crazy. The lowest, I think, if you're looking at it, there's some around $14, there's some around $15, but a lot of this places on the East Coast, some of the more expensive states, you're looking upwards of $20 or $30 an hour that you would need to make to afford a house. And again, when we're talking about what makes a house affordable, it's whatever you're paying on your rent or your mortgage is 30% of what you're taking in total income. So just looking at that and putting in context of what are actual jobs out there and what actual jobs pay, 12 of the 20 largest occupations. So we're talking about people who are secretaries, we're talking about home healthcare workers, we're talking about maybe an Uber driver, we're talking about retail sales workers, huge numbers of employed people can't afford the housing wage that they've calculated. So they can't even afford a 1-bedroom housing wage. So hopefully this sets the stage for why this is an issue. You know, what is affordable housing? And we don't remotely have enough, and it's not accessible to a lot of people. So why does it matter? First and foremost, it creates stability and it creates access to education and healthcare and food and the like. So I don't know how many people have read the book Evicted, and if you haven't read it, I would highly recommend it. But one of the main takeaways of the book is that if you have housing instability, so you're unable to pay your rent and so you're evicted and you have to move, or you can't afford rent and you have to go somewhere else, or you're far away from your job so you lose your job and you're constantly shifting around, it has hugely detrimental impacts on childhood education, on growth, on job opportunities, and the like. And they just all become cumulative, right? So if you're constantly moving because you can't afford a place to live and you constantly have unstable housing, just terrible outcomes. So they found if you have housing and you have stable housing that you can afford, you can stay in it and you can live in it. So in a 2011 study, and some of these are older numbers, but families living in affordable housing spent nearly 5 times more on healthcare and 1/3 more on food compared to severely cost-burdened peers. So if you've given somebody or provided somebody with affordable housing, they have significantly more money to spend on food for their kids. They have significantly more money to spend on healthcare. And it's just, I mean, I think, you know, there's more and more discussions about, I think it's health in the environment, and I don't know the correct words for it, but if you think about this plays directly into health outcomes as well. If you don't have enough food, if you don't have access to healthcare, it's highly problematic. So one of the things, and this is where we start getting into the nexus, I think, between housing and the environment, is it's not just having affordable housing, it's actually where it's located. So we have a long history in the US of discrimination and throughout housing. So if you're looking back starting in the 1930s and then going forward, there's various things that the government did or permitted or private companies did that discriminated and segregated people in this country. So one of the things to look at is redlining, which was a policy of, they basically literally drew red lines around maps in cities and would not loan to people in those areas. And those were predominantly Black areas, which which meant that you couldn't own a home, or you couldn't get a loan to own a home, and you couldn't start to build the wealth that you would need for future generations. One of the things that's really interesting that we found recently is a friend just bought a house in DC. She was looking back through all of the old deeds, and in one of the deeds, she found a deed restriction that the house could not be sold to somebody of African descent. So this wasn't just in loans or in policies. This was actually written into the very restrictions on the land itself. And that's like not an anomaly. That happened across many countries, or many cities, many states. And so why is that problematic? If you think about how we grow wealth and how we grow stability in this country, a lot of it is around equity in your home. So if you're trying to put your kid through college and you own your own home, you might take out a second loan based on the equity in your home to finance the kid going through college. Or when you die, you pass on a home that then can either be sold or lived in by your family. Again, you're creating this stability, you're creating ongoing wealth. And so they looked at, they've done studies on wealth generation versus white versus Black communities. And so since 1948, in this one area of Ohio, white working class families gained over 3 generations, gained over $200,000 in wealth. And the equivalent in a similar area for Black families was $45,000. So if you think about that exponentially, you start to invest $200,000 versus $45,000, makes a huge, huge difference. So there's ongoing locational equity issues that started long ago when we had all of these rules about who could buy or who couldn't buy homes that continue today, because now you're seeing communities of color and poor neighborhoods not integrated, but stuck in one section with very little mobility outwards. And so that's really important, because they're finding more and more, and there's various studies around mixed income neighborhoods, that it can be the concentration of poverty that causes a lot of these issues. So every extra year that a child spends in a low poverty neighborhood improves the child's economics outcome as an adult, looking at income and likelihood of college attendance. And so one of the things that they looked at is one of the programs that we have is a voucher program that allows you to move to a wealthier or a more upper income neighborhood. And when you move to a lower poverty neighborhood, there was children who were younger than 13 found their earnings as adults increased by approximately 31% and experienced an increased likelihood of living and continuing to live in lower poverty neighborhoods as adults. So if you think about that, location really, really matters of where you are and where you put this housing. But it's not just about, are you in a high poverty neighborhood or in a low poverty neighborhood? It's also, where are you, and this is where we start to move into the environmental side. Are you in a floodplain? Are you next to a factory? If you look at where the poor neighborhoods are in cities or in towns, they're on the cheapest land because it's cheapest to build affordable housing in cheap land. But that comes with a whole number of issues around health and the environment. So when you're looking at flooding areas, if a family owns their own home and has a stable income that's coming in and there is a flood, the New York Times did a study on disaster relief in, I think, Oregon and California. The families that made over $100,000 or $200,000 and had a home that they owned got a faster response from FEMA than the families that were significantly poorer and were renting, right? Because you can point to your house and say, my house was flooded, therefore, and I owned it, therefore you should give me this much in disaster relief. And the renters had significantly higher levels of instability. They were moved farther away from their jobs when they were put into temporary housing, and they didn't own their home. They had no equity in their home. And so if the landlord decides, hey, I'm not going to rebuild, you have no place to go. And so the impacts of climate change on low income renters I mean, it's bad for all of us, but significantly worse for people who are located in already the climate sensitive areas and then already have a lot of instability, and it just creates worse outcomes for them. So I already jumped the gun on what this has to do with the environment, but it's a lot. And I think that housing and the environment have a really interesting intersection around location and justice. So thinking about where do you put your housing and how do you build your housing, and how is that impacted by, or how is that related to environmental justice and just equitable justice for people. So I wanted to focus on 4 different pieces here, which is one we've already talked about, which is where is the housing located, and how does that impact the people who live in it. So, you know, if you're in a floodplain, which is cheaper, you then are at higher risk for getting flooded. And do you have renter's insurance? And do you have all of the things that are costly that would impact your ability to pay for food, pay for healthcare, pay for schooling? So that's what I think about when I think about location and housing. But then you can also think about that from an environmental resiliency and climate change side. We shouldn't be building affordable housing or housing in floodplains. And if you're thinking about smart development from an environmental side, where are we putting these homes? And that's a crucial question that needs to be answered, both for what are the best environmental outcomes, but then what are also the best people outcomes. So then you think a little bit around location and environmental justice. So are we putting communities of color and poor communities next to factories? On my side, I think about that and what does that do for asthma? What does that do for access to groceries and food deserts, and where have you put people? If you're thinking about it, moving on to the little car icon, from the environmental perspective, if you've put housing closer to a public transportation node, or you've put it closer to a grocery store or closer to jobs, that reduces emissions. It improves air quality, and from the people side, for me, that means life is cheaper because you are closer to your job and you don't have to pay as much for gas, and you don't have to worry about what if your car breaks down, and you don't have to worry about your kid having an asthma attack because we've improved the air quality and the like. And finally, beyond just location, there's also thinking about green building materials and energy efficiency. So again, when I think about energy efficiency from my perspective, I'm thinking about it less for the environmental impacts, and I'm thinking about it more for if I have solar panels on the roof of an affordable housing complex and I can reduce the utility costs that my tenants are paying, then they have more money now to spend on food, to spend on clothes and the like. At the same time, there's an environmental win because now you've moved your utilities away from coal and moved it towards solar or wind or whatever it is. So I think there's a lot of things that can be married where both groups might be working at different goals. For example, I want to reduce the cost for my tenants, but there's also huge impacts around the environment, particularly around emissions and climate change issues. So how do we pay for affordable housing? I mean, the crucial part is just money. It needs to be built. And one of the best quotes I heard, and it's intuitive when you think about it, but I hadn't thought about it before, is a brick costs the same whether or not it's for a rich person or a poor person. So at the end of the day, there are basic costs of housing that just don't change. And so if you are building, I figured I would go through how you finance market rate buildings and how you finance affordable housing, because this is where the rubber meets the road. On market rate financing, you have your cost, you have the cost of the land, you have the construction cost, you have various fees, and then you're building based off of what you think the future revenues are. So those are market rate rents, and they're designed to both pay off the debt that you took on and then make a return. And so people are making profit from market rate financing, and can guarantee, okay, we're going to be getting, say, as it was in New Haven, the example, $1,100 a month from 30 units, and we'll be able to pay off our debt. You also often have real estate developers who have a fair amount of money and so are putting their own equity in, which reduces the debt that they have to take on. So that's on this right side of the slide deck, which is the sources that you have for market rate financing, or your own money or an investor's money, and commercial debt. And then you have told both of those parties that your rents are going to come in and they will pay off the debt and they will make a return for the investor. Affordable housing is very different, in large part because there's more costs, and then because you have less revenue coming in. So your land costs are the same or very similar to market rate. You have construction fees, construction costs, generally the same. Maybe you can save a little bit of money on those. You have your standard fees. And then you also have to think about wraparound services, or what else do you want to provide for your tenants, which can increase your costs. The biggest difficulty here is that you have lower rents, which are coming in, which means you have to find a way to make financing cheaper. There's a lot of big banks, unless you found other sources of financing, aren't going to come in and finance the whole building if the rents don't pay back the bank for its loan. So we have this concept of what's called gap financing. So you have your developer equity, which often when you're working with a nonprofit or an affordable housing developer is very low because they're not making huge profits off of their prior buildings. You have a little bit of commercial debt, and then you have to fill the gap. So when you're filling the gap, you use an inordinate number of sources. So one of the things that makes affordable housing so complicated, and why I have a job, is because you have, instead of having one lender and one investor, you have one investor, your developer, a lender, a subordinate lender, so maybe a county or a city or a town, maybe some grant funding, maybe you're working with HUD, and all you're trying to do is patchwork stuff together so that you have enough money so that the rents that are coming in are able to pay off the debt. And you're trying to make the debt as cheap as you possibly can, so that, if you're only getting $624 a month, but would really need $1,100 a month to pay off your debt, how do you fill that gap? So the big one that you see on most affordable housing deals, and the one that if you dig further into this field, we'll hear a lot about, is LIHTC, which is low income housing tax credits. And it's a way of bringing in private investment as in equity into a project, and they get tax credits in return. So normally when you have an equity investment, I would take my $100 and I would put it in the company, and I would expect that I would get my $100 back, and then I would get a return on that. So whatever the profits were, I would get back in addition to my $100. In the tax credit world, when I'm an investor, I put my $100 in. I might get a little bit of return, but I don't expect to get my $100 out. Instead, what I'm getting is a tax credit from the federal government. And so I know that the environmental world and environmental finance world is full of public-private partnerships and trying to get private companies to take actions and whatnot. The community economic development world is very much the same. It's a lot of the government trying to figure out ways to incent private individuals or private companies to put money in, and whether or not you get a tax credit or you get regulatory credit if you're a bank for investing in affordable housing. They have all these different tools that you have to layer together. So then there's other programs, home and CDBG, or housing trust funds, or local housing funds. Those are all done through the state or the local governments, and they are all different pools of money, each with their own set of strings attached, that are typically loans into the project, but usually for very low interest rates, and often have very, very soft repayment terms. So if you take out a loan and you're buying a house, you personally take out a loan from Citibank, they will require that you pay them back on their loan every month. when you're talking about some of these funds that are listed down here, the National Housing Trust Fund, the local housing funds, you only have to pay them, you have to pay them back at the end of their term. But during the period in which you're operating the housing, you only have to pay them back if you have money to do so. And that's one of the things that makes a big difference in affordable housing is you have a lot of lenders who come in through these government programs and won't require you to have to, it's not must pay debt anymore. You don't have to pay the loan back during the term of the loan. You only have to pay it back if you have enough income. And more often than not, because you're charging lower rents, you don't have enough income to pay it back. So it just sort of sits there and accumulates income, but it allows you to rent these units at cheaper levels. So as opposed to thinking about reducing your debt or how do you get cheap financing so you can build the building, there's also ongoing subsidies which are designed to up the income that you're getting from your units. So you have Section 8 or you have local subsidy programs. DC has a really good local subsidy program where the government will say, all right, the tenant's going to pay 30% of their income, whatever that is. So it could, for some that I was looking at the other day, they pay $1 or they pay $10. I mean, they're really not making all that much. And the government will do the difference. So if you should be renting this apartment for $1,100 a month, and that's what you need in order to pay off your debt, we'll pay the difference between what the tenant can pay and what you will owe to the bank. And that's a very simplified version of Section 8 and these subsidy programs, but they're incredibly helpful because, again, they allow you to provide affordable housing. So at the beginning I was talking, or earlier on I was talking about in the environmental pieces of housing. And so you think about green housing, building materials, or you think about putting solar on a roof and better energy efficiency requirements. And then when I've talked about the financing here, it's really only been about buildings. So when the existing housing financing programs are really about the brick and mortar of the building. So sometimes, you can put in more green building materials, but if you drive up your costs too high, then you fall out of, you don't do as well in the various competitive programs to get these funds. So there's a really interesting tension here between how do we make green housing, but then how do we pay for it? Because an overarching issue that I haven't really addressed is generally people don't really like paying for affordable housing. We have all of these, the government used to build housing and we had public housing in the past. It was a political decision or a policy decision that didn't make sense. So now we're going to have private investors invest to build housing and then get tax credits back. So there's less and less direct outlays from the government to build housing, which means there's more and more stringent requirements on costs because the government is no longer directly controlling costs. They're controlling costs through all of their different financing programs. So one of the programs that I've noticed you get is a competitive program for financing. You get extra points for being green and for following the green code and meeting Earthcraft requirements. On the flip side, there's a cost cap on how much you can spend per affordable housing unit. And so if you think about that tension here as how do we get building materials cost low enough so that we can stay within the cost requirements, but still create sustainable green housing. And people haven't figured it out, which gets me to my next point, which is how do we think about financing, some of these green infrastructure or green housing investments when the whole system of financing we've built doesn't address that at all. So I talked a little bit about green building materials, but one of the things they've found around health and nature is that if people are located next to parks, there's good health outcomes. But what do you do in a neighborhood that has no parks? How do you finance a park? How do you make any money? How do you get an investor to invest in a park? We worked on a project in Alexandria where there is now a park next to, I think it's about a 60-unit affordable housing complex. It's the first park in this neighborhood. It will make a huge difference in the community, both on an environmental side, but then on a health side. But it was really hard to finance. And at the end of the day, the city had to step in with funds and say, hey, this is a priority for us. We want to do this. But getting that financed through normal housing sources, it's just not currently done. How do you finance energy efficiency? If it's already really hard to pay off your debt as a developer of affordable housing, how do you ask a developer to take on more debt to put solar panels on their roof or change the windows? So some of the things, the Connecticut Green Bank, which I'm sure you guys have probably heard about, because I think there's actually a lot of Yale students who work at the Connecticut Green Bank, thinks about this, about like how do you get into this market around low-income housing and targeted towards lower income communities, and how do you make energy efficiency, how do you make solar panels affordable, and how do you get landlords to put them in place? And we talked about the benefits, right? There's environmental benefits for climate change, but then there's also direct benefits to the tenants of having more money in their pocket to do other things, but it is hard. Similarly, stormwater financing, and so as you're building buildings, a better environmentally or more environmentally sound building would have stormwater infrastructure and would think about impervious surfaces and the like. But if you don't have enough money to do that, how do you finance that? And if all of our housing programs are built around the units and paying for a unit, how can you also work in some of these green issues around it? And I think another thing to think about is the importance of city and local and state priorities. So neither of the examples I have here in Atlanta or DC are perfect, but in Atlanta, there's a belt line that they've done, and they have a goal to have affordable housing around a park that will eventually circle the entire city. And so they're not super successful right now in getting affordable housing next to it because it's quite expensive, because developers, seeing that there's going to be a park, knowing that there's going to be commercial opportunities, have bought up a lot of the land, which makes it more expensive for affordable housing people to build on. But they're thinking about, okay, how do we place people next to parks and spaces? DC is has a goal to spread affordable housing throughout all of DC, which means you're going to have affordable housing units in some of the areas with cleaner air and more access to public transportation, as opposed to all crowded down on one side of the city. So Eugen, I want to be cognizant of time. Are we okay for?
Yeah, we're good.
Okay. So the final question is how do we maintain affordability, or what happens when the affordability restrictions expire? So all of those programs that I listed have affordability requirements that run with the land. So they are recorded, a document is recorded with the land that says this needs to remain affordable for 15 years, 30 years, sometimes 40 years. And I actually just did one that was 75 years, but most of the time it's 30 years. So what happens at the end of 30 years? If you're in a rapidly gentrifying neighborhood, will somebody want to sell the property and make money? How do you even know that you can continue? If it's a nonprofit developer, are they going to be able to afford to rehabilitate and keep this property affordable? And so one of the ongoing issues in the community economic development space is how do we think about keeping things affordable in the long term? And so there's a couple examples. One is rent control, which honestly I am less familiar with and don't work as much, but is one way of keeping rental housing affordable in rapidly gentrifying areas. Another one is permanent affordability programs. So DC has one where if they fund any residential development, a certain percentage has to be permanently affordable, and the developer agrees, and it's usually about 99 years that they've agreed to keep this building or this unit affordable. Another one is tenant purchase options. So again, I work in DC and live in DC, so the best example I have of this is in DC, before a building can be sold, if you have tenants, you have to offer it to your tenants to purchase. So we've worked with tenant associations that have formed together to buy their building and then maintain affordability, owning it as tenant associations, when previously, without that rule, the building would have just been sold. It would have been probably converted to luxury condos, and the tenants would have been kicked out. And finally, as community land trust, and I focused most of this presentation on rental housing, but another large part of affordability and thinking about affordability and affordable housing are community land trusts, which are around homeownership. So community land trusts are different than conservation land trusts, but somewhat related. In the community land trusts are all about obtaining and stewarding affordable home ownership for people, and sort of creating a pot of land and buildings that can be owned by a low-income family, but the community land trust would own the land. So in the conservation land space, the owner continues to own the land, but has sold a conservation easement to the land trust that says, okay, we're not going to develop, or we're not going to do X, Y, or Z. In the community land trust world, it's similar, but a little bit different, which is the low-income owner will own the home, which is really important for building equity. It's really important for having something to pass down to your kids. But the community land trust will own the land underneath and will lease it to the homeowner on a 99-year lease, which in the real estate world is an incredibly long period of time. So it's seen as, an ongoing lease. But the lease includes affordability requirements, which is, if you don't pass this home on to your kids, or your kids don't inherit, when you want to sell the property, you have to sell it to another low-income family at an affordable rate. So when you're thinking about gentrification, and when you're thinking about people getting forced out of neighborhoods, this is one way of keeping some houses in a neighborhood affordable for people to purchase, as opposed to having all of the housing prices rise up. There is a flip side to this, and this is what's so interesting, right? Is in at first blush, having affordable home ownership for perpetuity is really great. It's permanently affordable. It means you have a mixed income neighborhood. Some of the houses are going to be worth in the millions and purchased only by people with really high salaries. Others can be purchased by the teacher, or a fireman, or a home healthcare nurse. So you have stability in the neighborhood, you have a mixed neighborhood, lessening the impacts of gentrification. On the flip side, in the very beginning, or earlier on in this presentation, I talked a little bit about the importance of building equity. Because it is kept permanently affordable, when you sell the house, you don't make quite as much money as somebody else would who had the ability to sell it without any affordability restrictions. So a friend of mine lives in a section of DC, and he and his wife are have diametrically opposed beliefs around a community land trust. For him, he lives in Anacostia, which is on the other side of the river in DC, which has been historically underinvested area that is now, people are really starting to put money in. There's fears of gentrification. His wife is all about having a community land trust because she wants to make sure that not all of the houses get bought up and houses remain affordable for people that live in the community. And he is frustrated because if you bring that in and you bring that model in, you don't actually get to benefit, if you're a homeowner, from rapidly appreciating property. So he's looking at it saying, well, wait a second, if other people have the right to buy a house and then have the price go up and sell it and make a lot of money, why shouldn't we? Why shouldn't we have that same right on this side of the river? And it's a really interesting, and I think that's an ongoing tension of the community land trust, which is no one housing tactic is perfect and none is going to work completely, and they all have certain drawbacks. And so you really have to figure out what is the best set of trade-offs that you can make to build permanently affordable housing. And when you're talking with somebody who's buying into this model, are they okay with the fact that they're putting permanent affordability for other people ahead of their own personal equity gain? And some people are, and some people aren't. So last but not least, I think just from some takeaways, one, affordable housing is a huge issue in the US, has really big impacts on health, kids, access to jobs, and the like, and we don't have enough. I think there's lots of ways for the environmental movement and folks who work in the environment to be connected to or work with community economic development practitioners. I think there's a lot of space, particularly around health and the environment, and around smart growth and building, and where do you decide to develop, and how do you decide to develop? So how do we get green building materials down, or the cost of green building materials down, or how do we continue to make solar and energy efficiency affordable for people and attractive to landlords? And how do we think really carefully about city planning? And then finally, just because it takes up a lot of my day, but funding really matters. And I think you guys see it in the environmental side as well, but we just need more funds to build more affordable housing, and to build more green and sustainable affordable housing. And so, there's an upcoming election, there's ongoing elections and advocacy pieces. And I would say if you have a moment and you're personally looking for something to advocate for, I would highly recommend for more funds to affordable housing. We currently don't have enough money to build the affordable housing we need. So with that, any questions?
Paige, I have a quick question.
Yeah.
What about the CPACE programs? Do you guys use those for the retrofits?
Yeah, we have used those actually, and I should thank you for flagging that. I should have noted on there. It's been a few years since I've worked on a CPACE program. Yeah, I think that's another way of financing the green ones. I think where I've seen, again, it just adds another layer of complication, and so you have to find the bank who understands how it works. And even I'm struggling to remember exactly how it all functions. And then how do you keep transaction costs down? I'm a lawyer, so when I'm drafting documents, that's great because I have a job and it employs me, but it can start to get really expensive even though it's designed to make energy efficiency cheaper. So
right, I've never actually seen it in action, but I know that Connecticut does have programs for the CPACE. Yeah. And from my understanding, basically you would get the upfront costs for the initiative or for solar panels. It actually covers a lot of different things. And then through tax assessments, that's how it would be paid back, and it's a long-term, low interest rate loan.
Yeah, yeah, and that's the tax assessment. I mean, we do a lot of financing for housing, and now for the for energy through tax.
Right. So would that max it out? I mean, would it even be relevant if you already have excessive tax assessments on the property, if it's financed that way?
It depends. I mean, I think I'm trying to remember. We did one. I worked on one putting solar panels on the roof of a YMCA here, and I think what they did is they also took out. It was like a triangle transaction. So they had they had the funds up front, they had the tax assessment to pay it back, and they took out a loan from a commercial bank to finance it during the period in which the taxes were being paid back or being used to fund. But I'm happy to dig more and then talk to you later about it, because I don't know that I can answer.
Yeah, no, that was my understanding too, was that it was from third party. So it wasn't actually any liability for the governments, it was a third party loan.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it looks like there was a question from Karina on new pots of funding for emerging green builds and green infrastructure that ties to health outcomes. I don't know if this directly answers your question, Karina, but what I'm pretty excited about is insurance companies have started thinking about investing in affordable housing, in part because they are, well, one, they have tax liability that they need to offset, but two, they're starting to think about how housing ties to health, which I think gets at your issue. And I think when I would hope that when they're thinking about financing affordable housing, that they are pushing on the green infrastructure and the green builds, because that I think also directly ties to health outcomes as well. But it's going to depend on basically who talks to that insurer and gets them into the market, and gets them to build or gets them to invest. But I think there's more and more folks now in the health world or hospital systems who are starting to think about, we can reduce a lot of our costs of, you know, people coming into the emergency room or asthma attacks or the likes by investing in or building affordable housing. So I think it's coming. I don't think it's yet been defined who the players are or even what that looks like yet.
That was a great presentation, Paige, and I think it really brought together all of the different disciplines that you have to think about when you're working on urban issues. And you so articulately went from, you know, health to community development, housing to environment. So it was really super interesting. I really appreciate it. I have a question in terms of when we're looking at kind of this feeling of inevitability in how we plan our cities or how we capitalize our cities, and you know, are there kind of these third options we think about? Like, for example, is there in the community development world advocacy on the idea of kind of basic minimum income? So that kind of gets you a little bit around the last issue you brought up about community land trusts. I'd just love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I can't speak for the community economic development field as a whole on this answer, but as I was putting this presentation together, and then as I've been thinking about it more generally, I think the more you look into it, the more, not all of the issues are solved, but many of the issues are solved by minimum wage or basic income. I mean, I started the presentation with housing costs X, and we don't pay people enough to afford housing. And there is a level at which, you know, again, going back to the comment of a brick is a brick, there is a cost to steel, there is a cost to concrete that just doesn't change. And there's, you know, right now we're in an incredible space where debt is really cheap because the interest rates are so low, but it is still really hard to build affordable housing because you don't have enough revenue coming in off the side. So I think that, although I think our advocacy in the community economic development housing space has mostly focused on getting more funding from the government or from investors, or, you know, thinking about there are other investment sources. I think we probably should, I don't know if we're having that conversation on the large scale, but I think that should be part of the conversation, which is, you know, how do we get, if we have more funding for affordable housing, we're sort of just putting a Band-Aid on the issue, not actually changing the fact that people don't have enough money coming in to access healthcare, access food, clothes.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I have another question about Section 8.
Yeah.
I know that I used to be a case manager in New York, and I remember when Section 8, basically you can only be grandfathered in, right, at this point, right? Because like the program isn't open continually. Mm-hmm. So I was wondering, in your experience, like if you saw how that shift, like did that then sort of catalyze other funding sources, or was it really just like a really big hit on people accessing affordable housing because they couldn't then get a new Section 8 voucher?
Yeah, so I have a couple of responses, and apologies to everybody else for getting a little bit wonky here. But so Section 8, just to jump back so everyone's on the same page, is a program where the government provides vouchers or funds to the tenant or to the building to support affordable housing. So there's two types of vouchers. There's one which follows the tenant. So if I'm a tenant, I'm given a voucher and I can go around to different landlords and say, hey, will you take this voucher? The government will pay. There's some really interesting questions about that actually working, because a lot of landlords will not accept Section 8 vouchers, and there's any number of reasons why. Sometimes it's because the government takes too long to inspect the unit, or then there's a whole bunch of, you know, classism and racism and all sorts of stuff tied up as well. There's another type of Section 8 contract which isn't fully subscribed yet, but that's where it goes to the developer, and it's tied to the unit. So, you know, unit A through E of an affordable housing complex will always have, or well, usually 20-year terms, but will have a Section 8 voucher tied to that unit. So it doesn't transfer with the tenant. It stays with the unit no matter who the tenant is. So those ones we're seeing more and more of those project-based Section 8 contracts, because they allow the developer to, you know, have their income coming in, and then they can go through the normal housing authority website or waiting list to get people in. One of the things that we've seen though, and then so what you alluded to is there are way more people on the list at public housing authorities to get onto the Section 8 wait list and into a Section 8 unit than there are units or vouchers. And to the point to which, as you had said, and just so others know, housing authorities who manage these wait lists have closed the list entirely. So some people have been waiting on the list several years, if not more. So what we've seen is state and local subsidy programs. And so again, I work a lot in DC, Maryland, and Virginia, but DC has the equivalent of a Section 8 program that it's done that funds units here in DC. And so I think that's what people are moving towards. There's also ways of financing how affordable units are. So the generally when they're looking at you know, how much rent should you have to pay, or what's an eligible income, it's based on area median income. So it's 60% of area median income is seen as low income, and 30% of area median income is seen as very low income. And in the past, it's been really hard. And so the 30% people are typically going to be the folks who would be eligible for a voucher. It is very hard to finance building a 30% unit. And so there was a recent change to the tax laws in the last couple of years that allows affordable housing developers now to have units at 80% of area median income. So still, you know, well below what the median income is in a city or a state, so that they can cross-subsidize the 30% units. So I think that's another way that folks have been trying to handle it is, you know, can we move around who's paying what for units so that we can use the wealthier units to cross-subsidize for lower. But it still doesn't solve the issue that there's a lot of people on these lists who aren't going to get on, and there's a great need for more.
I have a quick question. You emphasized the importance of location for affordable housing. I was wondering if you could touch on what the process is like when a developer is, you know, determining a location. Like, I know environmental impact analyses are, you know, pretty often uncommon, but do they factor in like health impacts, like access to transportation and all of that?
Yeah, so it's interesting on the health impacts. I don't think I've seen that yet, but I'm wondering if that's going to come down the line. It's certainly access to transportation definitely drives a fair amount of location, even more so now. And that's actually because of how the statewide incentives work. So under the low-income housing tax credit program, you have to apply and you have to meet certain metrics and you have to score a certain amount. And one of the ways to score a fair number of points is to be within, or, you know, for example, in Virginia, you have to be within a quarter mile of a public transportation node. So I think we're seeing developers being pushed by policy to locate in those areas. So they are thinking about transportation, and particularly the folks with wraparound services, right? So when I talk about wraparound services, I'm talking about, do you bring a doctor on site? Do you have after school care for kids? those folks are how close, those folks are thinking about how close are they to a grocery store. And so they do bring it into thinking about it. The problem is at the end of the day, land, particularly when you're in a city, is expensive. And then a lot of people still don't want affordable housing near them. So on one of my other slides, I had NIMBY, which is not in my backyard, which I didn't go into. But when I was working in an affordable housing developer in Oregon, we had a town meeting, or like a zoning meeting, where we got up to speak in favor of a transit-oriented development. So we were going to have a development right near the bus line so folks could get into the city to work. And a woman got up and spoke, and she had gone through our housing program and had been a renter in our units. And so she got up there, and we thought she would be in support of this. And she said, I went through your programs. They were great. I just bought a house that is right next to where this proposed development will be. I don't want those people there because I want my my housing price to remain high, or the value of my house to remain high. And it was fascinating because this was a woman who had benefited from the very rental units that she was now didn't want in her yard. So when developers are thinking about siting, some of it is based on access to transportation and the like, and then some of it is just what is available and how big is the community pushback. We've had interesting things in DC, which is a very liberal city, but then when you start pushing for more affordable housing in some of the wealthier neighborhoods, people don't like it because it changes the character of the neighborhood. And that's been disguised as like, well, we have single family homes and you want to build, a 60 unit building, but that's, is that code for other things, or, that keeps people out of your neighborhood and keeps it unaffordable. I don't know if that fully answers your question. I think it is. They do think about it, but at the end of the day, it's where is the land and where can they make it work and finance it.
Yeah, thank you. We have time for one question, if anyone has any. Otherwise, we are at time.
Just one last one. I'm sorry, I didn't want to take the last question because I already had one. But I was just wondering, in that example, is that Section 8 or affordable housing that she was concerned about?
It was affordable housing generally.
So it wasn't specifically Section 8?
No, and I think what's so interesting is there's a lot of like boogeyman words now associated with affordable housing. So people hear Section 8 and they go, or people hear projects, or they think affordable housing and they think of, stuff from the 1960s that was not well built and was super dangerous. And they don't realize that a lot of affordable housing you can't even tell is affordable housing. I mean, there's sections of New Haven. You can tell the stuff built in the 60s because it's usually brick and it's kind of ugly and built, but the modern day affordable housing, I mean, this is a picture on this last slide is a picture of affordable housing that's being built today. It might have Section 8 units. Anyone walking by wouldn't know. So I think it was more of a gut reaction to the specter of than anything else, and the feeling that if you have affordable housing next door, your house will lose value, which is true and is not true depending on the situation.
Thanks, Paige.
Yeah. Well, thanks to you all. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. I left my email at the bottom of this page.
Thank you so much, Paige. And everyone, thank you for joining, and have a wonderful rest of the week.
All right, take care, everyone.
Thank you.